Hey guys, welcome to this lesson on quote integration and quote formatting. This is an Earn Honors or Aspire to Do lesson. There's a lot of information here, so I'm going to try to jump right in. And know that there's no mastery check for this one. This is going to be just information to help you make your writing better. So you will be able to understand how to properly integrate quotes into your writing. Take the notes that you need, okay? But here we go. So what does it actually mean to integrate quotes? Well, to integrate means to combine one thing with another thing so that they become a whole, all right? So the idea when we're talking about integrating quotes is to be able to incorporate a direct quote or, direct textual evidence into larger sentences. What you don't want to do is just put quotes into your writing. This is where your sentence just begins with quotation marks and your text evidence is there and then it ends with citation. We call that a dropped quote. You actually want to introduce that quote so that the quote itself doesn't stand on its own, okay? The best way to do that is simply to use your own language to introduce the quote. So your little introduction plus the quote should equal one complete sentence. So there's three strategies in order to do this, okay? First, you have an introduction, you introduce the sentence. So you can introduce it, you can introduce with a full sentence that ends in a colon, and you don't use a colon if the text before the quote isn't a full sentence, okay? If you name the author in your sentence, and also if you name the author in your sentence, you want to use present tense verbs, okay? So the first way you can introduce a quote is by having a full sentence, and then colon, and then your quote, all right? The second way to introduce a quote is to use a signal phrase. Okay, a signal phrase that mentions the author or the source, but doesn't actually form a full sentence. And these you would follow with a comma instead of a colon, because it would only be a phrase that's leading into this quote. You can also use your own sentence, okay? So if you want to quote a phrase that doesn't form a full sentence, you can also integrate it as part of your own sentence without any extra punctuation whatsoever. So I'm going to show you examples of what these look like, okay? So if you're introducing a quote with a sentence where you're going to use the colon, it's going to be incorrect like this. In Denmark, a recent poll shows that, colon, a member referendum, okay? Notice that in Denmark, a recent poll shows that is not a complete sentence, okay? And if you're going to introduce with a complete sentence and use a colon, then this is the way it will look. In Denmark, a recent poll shows that the support for the EU has grown since the Brexit vote, colon. A membership referendum held today will be backed by 55% of Danish voters. If you want to introduce with a signal phrase, this is where you would use a comma, it's going to look something like this. According to a recent poll, comma, a membership referendum held today would be backed by 55% of Danish voters. And then here, actually, here's a second one. As Levering 2018 explains, comma, you do this a lot with your texts in literature, like according to Fitzgerald, or any author, and then you would do a comma and your quote. You could also introduce it with your own sentence, like a recent poll suggests that EU membership would be backed by 55% of Danish voters. And so what you notice is that the part of the quote that's being used and what's outside of the quote flow together as one complete sentence. That is actually, in my opinion, the strongest way of introducing quotations. I really like the use of signal phrases and using your own sentence to introduce the quotes. Okay, something else I know you're interested in is what happens when you have quotes inside of quotes. So when you have a quote, when you have quoted text that has another quote in it, this is called a nested quote, okay? It often happens when part of what you're saying as evidence has dialogue in it, right? Because the dialogue in a book already has double quotation marks around it. So in order to distinguish the dialogue from the larger quote that you are using, you want to surround the dialogue with single quotes instead of the double quotes. Okay, you can only use double quotes if the quote that you're using is only the nested quote, meaning if you're using dialogue only and nothing else, it's going to be double quote. But if you're using dialogue plus something else, then the single quotes will go around the dialogue and the double quotes will go around the outside. So again, I'm going to show you an example of nested. Okay, this is an incorrect way of looking at it. And what you're going to see here, and it's funny that this example comes from Gatsby, but what you see here is that we have a double quote to open, another double quote, and this tells you that whenever you feel like criticizing anyone is actually dialogue inside, right? You can see then there's another double quote, and then there's double at the end. Okay, this is too many double quotes, but what you can see is that whenever you feel like criticizing anyone is dialogue. Just remember that all people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had is dialogue. But he told me is actually from the text, but it's outside dialogue. Okay? So the way you do this differently is you do a double quote and a single quote here, and then another single quote to end the dialogue. Then when the dialogue picks back up, you have another single quote. When that dialogue ends, you have a single quote, and because you're finishing there, you have a double quote. You can also shorten quotes. This is when we use what's called ellipses. I'm going to talk about that right on this slide. But integrating sometimes requires you to actually change the quote itself. Sometimes part of a passage is redundant or irrelevant, and that's why you want to shorten it. Sometimes you're going to shorten it because you want to remove words or phrases, and that's when you replace them with ellipses. And when you do that, you add a space before and after the ellipses. That's your ... But you want to be careful when you're shortening quotes not to change the overall meaning, okay? Your ellipses are going to indicate that you removed words, but your author's point needs to still be there. You can't remove anything that takes away from that point that's being made. So, for example, as Darwin puts it, natural selection acts solely by accumulating slight successive favorable variations, ... Notice there's a space before, a space after. It can act only by very short and slow steps. So we needed this piece that it can act only by very short and slow steps. Otherwise, the overall idea would have been lost if we had just ended it after variations. You can also alternate quotes, okay? And so aside from doing that, aside from shortening, you can actually replace words. So you might do this because your text might not fit the rest of your writing grammatically. You may need to add extra information. And so to do this, you use brackets. And this indicates that a word has been added or a word has been changed in your quote. Okay? So as an example, Smith states that those participants with the highest scores were generally older than the average. And we can see that the word participants has been added in, this is the writer's own word, in order for this sentence to flow grammatically. Without the word participants, it would sound weird, right? It would say, Smith states that those with the highest scores were generally older than the average, and we don't know who those are. And so in order to know who those are, the author adds in the word participants. So that's what you do with brackets. You can also change things in brackets. Like, for example, if you want to change the word I to a he or a she, then you would remove the word I and you would put the word he or she in brackets. Again, if you want to dig in more to quote integration, citation, shortening or altering quotes, or any sort of information with quotes, please check out this article that is attached. And now you know how to do it. You can come back to this video at any time to help you, but this should help you strengthen your writing. So sorry for the long video, but good work getting through it.